Now, how can I get you smiling? Well, this made me smile first thing this morning. It's a little video telling the truth about NATO. It plays out. I had to play it out with the music, but I'll tell viewers who are listening what it had to say in just a moment. So there we are, little video. It's basically saying it's a myth that NATO is at war with Russia because NATO is a defensive organization and it only works with its members to keep everyone safe. But of course, the reality is it's pumping in arms and weapons to fight Russia in a proxy war. Yes, that is a real war where over 500,000 men have been slaughtered. And the arms are still going in. And of course, our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is very pleased that his Labour Party is going to pump in more arms. So Ukraine, not a member of NATO. We'll have a little bit more about that later in the news. But that proxy war being fought via the Ukrainians. So a little bit of fantasy, which I enjoyed with my morning cup of tea. Just crass. Mark, let's bring you on because you're going to take us through a bit more detail on the 2024 NATO summit.
Yes, indeed, gentlemen and Diane. It starts this week. Oh boy, the 2024 NATO summit marking 75 years of the alliance. 75 years ago, just 12 countries signed that North Atlantic Treaty in Washington to ensure their collective defense in an unpredictable world. Now it's 32 allies meeting again in Washington. So that's the meaning of doing this in DC again. And we'll move on from there and kind of paint a general preview and overview of NATO. Not a lot of depth, but mostly breadth. But we'll look at a couple of the sins of NATO, you might say, along the way, which don't exactly speak to it being a purely defensive organization. Who NATO has a state, where DC is going to be 9 through 11 July, so that starts tomorrow. And they're going to address the challenges facing the alliance and further strengthens NATO deterrence and defense. That's what they say are the main goals. And we'll keep going from there. Here's Jens Stoltenberg, of course, a Bilderberg perennial. At the Washington summit, he says, we will demonstrate NATO's unity and strength once again in support of Ukraine and to keep all our people and values safe. One wonders about values in this context. Going on, collective defense and Article 5, and this gets into the basic principle of collective defense and says it's at the very heart of NATO's founding treaty. This is from NATO itself. It remains a unique and enduring principle that binds its members together, committing them to protect each other and setting a spirit of solidarity within the alliance. And we'll keep going. And that is basically the same thing. Here it gets into a little more details. Collective defense means that an attack against one ally is considered an attack against all allies within the NATO alliance. The principle of collective defense is enshrined in Article 5 in that North Atlantic Treaty. NATO invoked Article 5 for the first and only time in its history after the 9/11 terrorist attacks against the U.S. NATO took part in operations in Afghanistan, which did result in atrocities against civilians there that made quite a few headlines at the time. NATO has taken collective defense measures on several occasions, including in response to the situation in Syria and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, and it has standing forces on active duty that contribute to the alliance's collective defense efforts permanently. And we'll continue to go. The North Atlantic Treaty itself, here it is. I'll just get into the highlights just a little. The parties to this treaty reaffirmed their faith in the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and their desire to live in peace with all peoples and all governments. Now, what's interesting there is a lot of people forget that NATO is a direct offshoot of the UN. The UN Charter provided a regional arrangements mechanism, and out of that sprung NATO. And in Article 1 itself, it says the parties undertake as set forth in the UN Charter to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, and to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any matter inconsistent with the purposes of the UN. That's a qualification that is important. We'll get into that maybe an extra. But oops, along came NATO's Operation Unified Protector, which in its core existence ran from the 31st of March to the 31st of October back in 2011. This is Amnesty International's take on it. Libya, the forgotten victims of NATO strikes. The stated purpose of NATO's military operation in Libya, which were carried out at the request of and with the full support of a transition committee, was to protect the civilian population from grave human rights violations which were being perpetrated by the former Libyan regime, Gaddafi, with impunity. But that's not really the case. I won't get into all of this, but before it became the official Operation Unified Protector, on the 23rd of March in 2011, Allied forces announced they were in control of Libyan airspace after they disabled Libya's air force. And it goes on to say that according to NATO, the 7-month air and sea military campaign in Libya comprised more than 9,700 strike sorties and destroyed over 5,900 military targets. A very massive bombing campaign. There were airstrikes on homes that were documented, not only by Amnesty International guys, but by other organizations. Dozens of civilians had been killed in NATO airstrikes on private homes in residential and rural areas where Amnesty International, UN experts, that's ironic since they fight under the UN aegis, other NGOs and journalists found no evidence, get that, they found no evidence of military objectives at the strike locations at the time of the strikes in these residential areas. So NATO's not exactly looking purely defensive here, to say the least. Now, the Great Man-Made River Project, some of us may recall, and you can see the picture I inset there, a massive water transport system. You can see how small that man is compared to the pipeline. And the Great Man-Made River Project, Gaddafi created to transport enormous amounts of water to Libya, because Libya was, and I think still is, considered one of the most arid places on earth, or at least among the most arid. And according to the United Nations Children's Fund, 4 million of Libya's estimated population of 6.5 million faced serious water shortages in the wake of NATO having largely destroyed, or at least significantly damaged, this major water transport system, which many people saw as a really dirty pool and even possibly a war crime. And according to the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, which is where this came from, 11 years after Gaddafi's assassination, his main legacies, including the Great Man-Made River Project, are suffering the many consequences of NATO-supported rebellion that ended his rule. And the entire project's infrastructure is under threat, et cetera, et cetera. And what NATO did is it supported a faction there that was said to be a rebellion against Gaddafi's rule. So NATO allied itself with those that were seeking to overthrow Gaddafi. This is what we're told. According to the Ecologist.org, NATO deliberately destroyed Libya's water infrastructure, and that publication called it a war crime, noting the military targeting of civilian infrastructure, especially of water supplies, is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. That's what this outlet alleged. And we'll keep going from there and start to summarize this a bit. Some of the other sins of NATO this year, guys, is the 25th anniversary of the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. So we're leaving Libya now. We're getting into Yugoslavia as well as Serbia. And as I noted here, this is my own writing. NATO bombs Bosnia from August 30th to September 20th of 1995. That happened. And then in another case, NATO bombed Serbia/Yugoslavia for 78 days from the 24th of March to the 10th of June in 1999. So that's 1995 Bosnia in 1999, Yugoslavia. In Bosnia, NATO, via Operation Deliberate Force, used 400 aircraft and 5,000 personnel from 15 nations. 1,026 bombs were dropped on 338 targets, and in Yugoslavia, in that other instance, Serbia was then part of Yugoslavia. NATO bombs killed roughly 2,000 civilians. NATO bombs killed roughly 2,000 civilians, and material damages were between 30 and 50 billion. And in that latter case, the 78-day bombing campaign, reportedly there were TV stations completely destroyed, schools were damaged and hit, and many other civilian targets were completely or partially destroyed. So again, you look at NATO's history, especially its recent history, and you wonder about this cool, collective, purely defensive posture that it tries to sell everyone. At any rate, I did sign up as a UK column reporter for the NATO Public Forum. That's going to take place a little bit later this week, the 10th and 11th of July. And I understand that we're encouraging UK column viewers and members to also sign up. It's very easy, so we can have a little bit more of a presence at that event. Apparently, you can raise your hand digitally or virtually, that is, to ask questions, much like when I cover a WHO press conference. Hopefully, it'll be that user-friendly. Briefly, it describes it here. The NATO Public Forum is a public event jointly organized by NATO and the host government with civil society organizations also involved, taking place during the summit meetings of NATO's heads of state and government. And I won't get into all the details there. It's fairly self-explanatory. And we can look a little bit at the sponsors. And it includes Google, Microsoft, Atlantic Council. And so there's a lot of Bilderberg connections through those organizations and others, even Saab Motors, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, of course, not real unexpected there. The German Marshall Fund. If you look through it, our friends at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the former Chicago CFR, the McCain Institute, named after the warmonger John McCain, the former Arizona senator, the late senator there, and the Clinton Presidential Library is even among the sponsors and co-sponsors. So lots of names there and organizations that viewers can peruse if they want to freeze those slides. But that's basically it, gentlemen, and I'll be covering it this week, not only the public forum, but other matters as best I can to glean more from what they're having to say. So back to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Well, if NATO's heavy into war,